when I got to looking into the text, there are a lot of alliterations and puns in Hebrew Matthew that only make sense in Hebrew. So in Matthew 21:12, where Matthew or where Hebrew is flipping over the tables, we have an alliteration, shulchanot ha shulchanaim, and so you've got two words that sound very similar coming right after each other. Um, Jesus's commands to love your enemies, ahov et ahovakim. John the Baptist's words that he can raise sons from these stones. Beni Abraham meha banim ha'ali. You know, so over and over and over again, you have these cases of alliteration, these cases of puns that only make sense in Hebrew.
Thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. I'm here with Sean Kennedy. We're talking about, was Matthew originally written in Hebrew? Something that maybe we've heard the idea before, but not necessarily have looked too deeply into. Just the idea exists out there. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yep,
I'd
absolutely.
love to talk about this.
Yeah, for sure. It's a minority position, just like a little bit ago we had David Paulman, who believes in methane priority. But you're kind of like most folks. Mark was first, but
Yeah, I'm actually the reverse of him. He believes in Markan priority, but that Matthew was written in Greek. I believe that Matthew was written in Hebrew, but Mark was written first. And so, takes all kinds.
Yep, there you go. So, yeah, maybe you could give us a little bit of your background and how you maybe came to that the idea that Hebrew was the original language for Matthew.
Yeah, sure. So my background is that I'm really just a stay-at-home father and an amateur theologian. I never really had the money and the time to go to school. So if you ever watched the movie Moana, there's the part where Maui turns to her and says, "Tighten the halberd, bind the stays. You can't sail." And she goes, I'm self-taught." That's me.
Mhm.
I taught myself the basics of Hebrew and Greek, and when I was 21, I was 21 and I knew everything. Man, I miss knowing everything. And I said, I'm going to make my own translation of the Bible, and it'll be the best one ever. No, but along the way, I started, reading more and more about text criticism, because my first thing was the best Bible has to have the best translation has to have the best base text. And I started running into all kinds of problems, particularly in Matthew, when I was trying to dig out text criticism problems. And I prayed about it hard for about 2 weeks. And then in Portland, Oregon, they have a bookstore called Powell's Books. If you're ever in Portland, Oregon, go to Powell's Books. If you're a book person, you'll never leave. I went there, and wrongly shelved in a Bible section was Dr. George Howard's book, The Hebrew Matthew. And I bought that, and I read it, and I consumed it, and I loved it. And then I read the actual version of Matthew that he had preserved in there, and it was horrible. And I said, this is absolutely not it. And I he referenced two other editions of Matthew in Hebrew that were very closely related, and I managed to get my hands on a copy of the Hebrew manuscript 132 from the National Paris Library, and I spent about a year transcribing that from the photocopies I had into my computer so that I can look words up easier, and then about another 2 or 3 months making a quick and dirty translation, and I fell in love. It was my favorite version of Matthew. It was the only one I would use for 2 or 3 years. But like I said, it was a really quick and dirty one. To say it was hard to read is an understatement. And so I improved my Hebrew skills, and I made a better translation later. But there weren't enough differences to want to just use mine, and so I started using professional translations and then referencing anytime there was a deep question worth questioning. Now I would go back and every so often is like, oh, that's actually this Hebrew word. Well, that changes everything. And but few and far between. Very rarely do you run into that. That was back in 2001 that I started doing that. And just last year, 2022, I made the decision to pull together all of my information and start, and put together one massive document that would have all of my resources, all of my reasons for thinking that Matthew was written in Hebrew. Turned out to be about 30,000 words. And I was actually really impressed with what I had. And like I said, I'm a nobody from nowhere, but I am in the process of trying to distill that down to take one of the points and try and submit it to a journal. I suffer from a little bit of, I'm a nobody from nowhere, so nobody would ever read what I have. And I get in, tweak it 3 or 4 times a day, and I'm probably never going to be happy with it. But I'm setting myself a deadline of 2025 to try and start submitting that. Because as a writing teacher once told me, a paper is never done; it's only due, and I have to set my own due dates. I did make the decision in 2017 to go back to school and get my associate's degree. In 2020, my wife got an inheritance, and I was able to stop working and go back full time. And so the only way the universe was going to be able to stop me from getting my associate's degree was to have a global pandemic. And so after I got my associate's degree, I decided to stop. You're welcome. And I've been happy with my life ever since. Since then I have been the stay-at-home dad. My wife has been the working parent, and I write as a matter of my mental health. I do a blog, but that's pretty much it. Probably the first thing people are going to say is that this is something you just don't hear about. I so that I can know when a book is done, I publish it and put it on Amazon. And my Hebrew Matthew blog post and my book, the sales go up in September and July. And my running theory is people get into seminary and hear for the first time the church fathers said Matthew was written in Hebrew. They go to Amazon and type in Hebrew Matthew and buy my book. Thank you, by the way, if you're one of them. And then other people get to the end of their school year and they've been hearing about this and they finally got some time and they go to Amazon and type Hebrew Matthew and buy my book. And again, thank you if you're one of them. Also, if you're one of them, all the information is on my blog for free. So thank you more. I'm not actually in this to make the money. I'm in this for the mental health, and the published book is just my endpoint to say you finished something. Any talk about the evidence for Matthew and Hebrew has to start with the church fathers. The church fathers, universally, before about 1200, everybody said Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. Uh, of course, the first one we have reference to is Papias, and then after that we have Origen. Jerome goes into some details in the lives of illustrious men about Matthew's life, which we don't have anywhere else. He seems to either know or make up more than anybody else. Um, and then just on and on and on. Nobody ever questioned that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew until you get to about 12 or 1300, when people started actually trying to look into the original texts, and there were a couple of Hebrew manuscripts that people didn't like. Uh, Dr. George Howard is the most recent scholar to really dig into the question, and he digs into a family of manuscripts from a commentary by a Jewish rabbi uh, named Shem Tov. And the biggest problem with that is it's a commentary on Matthew, and it's hard to separate out Shem Tov's comments from the text of Matthew. And there are obvious places where he is not using the Hebrew text in front of him. There's a whole section where he copies about 4 verses out of Mark instead of Matthew. And so when I first got Howard's book, I forgot this story. When I was 21, I was starting to look into making my own translation of the Bible, and I was 21 and I knew everything, and I really miss knowing everything. That was a lot of fun knowing everything. Somehow I'm smarter now that I don't know everything. I don't know how that works. But I said I'm going to make my own translation of the Bible, and it will be the best because I'm the best. And no, it doesn't work like that at all. And I ran into a bunch of text critical problems in Matthew, particularly in Matthew, that I was not happy with how I was going to resolve them. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And the next time I was at Powell's Books, there was a copy of George Howard's Hebrew Matthew sitting on the shelf. And I opened it up and I read his reasons and I fell in love. And then I read the actual text of Matthew that he had, and my heart sank. It was not right. The old saying, let every word be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. He has so many things where obviously there's 3 or 4 words that are Shem Tov's commentary on what's going on, and nobody else has that anywhere. And then so he made reference to a couple of other manuscripts. One was by a German named Munster, and then another was to a manuscript at the National Library in Paris, manuscript 132. And I managed to get a hold of a book that had photocopies of manuscript 132 in the back, and I transcribed I typed all that manually into my computer so that I could look words up more easily, and then made a quick and dirty translation, and I fell in love. It was close enough to everybody else's translation of Matthew to say this is the same book, but there were a lot of little tidbits here and there where you could tell the Greek translation had been stretched just a little bit to match Matthew or to match Mark or Luke. The words didn't quite line up, and it was nice to be able to do that. And so I've never one of the problems I deal with is people will say that Howard's book has been debunked, and to be sure, there are problems with Howard's text. There are problems with Shem Tov's text. There are places where it stands alone in all of Matthew documents everywhere. That includes the other texts in the family. And so, text criticism is going to say, well, let's take those parts out that are just part of the commentary, that we can pretty reasonably say are just part of the commentary. When I got to looking into the text, there are a lot of alliterations and puns in Hebrew Matthew that only make sense in Hebrew. So in Matthew 21:12, where Matthew, or where Hebrew is flipping over the tables, we have an alliteration, shulchanot ha-shulchanaim, and so you've got two words that sound very similar coming right after each other. Jesus's commands to love your enemies, ahov et ahovakim. John the Baptist's words that he can raise sons from these stones, Beni Abraham Mehabanim Ha'ali. So over and over and over again, you have these cases of alliteration, these cases of puns that only make sense in Hebrew.
So what's the wordplay going on? So like with the first one, we have the cleansing of the temple.
Yeah.
And
So they both start out with shul sound, shul, if you were to do it in English. Shin lamed, if you were to do it in Hebrew. And that one in particular was one that stuck out to me because it's not in dialogue. It's in the text of Matthew. It's not something somebody's saying, it's something that somebody's doing. And then for the second one,
so the phrase like turning the tables.
yeah,
or
he's flipping over the tables. Sorry, what was that?
Got it. And so we're thinking maybe this is like something performative, like
Oops, I think I
this
lost
is
you.
like a story that a rabbi would say, kind of.
I don't know. I'm less familiar with rabbinical literature than with the Gospels, but it's definitely, it's something that only makes sense in Hebrew as far as being a wordplay. If we say roses are red and you translate that into Spanish, they probably don't start with R, and they probably don't even start with the same letter. I don't know any Spanish, so somebody will have to tell me what that is. But shulchanot ha-shulchanaim, flipping over the tables. It sounds very, very similar. And again, the word for love, ahuv, and the word for enemies, avonaim, they're very, very similar. And that makes sense in Hebrew. He's playing on the words.
Interesting. So you wonder, could this go to, maybe this could be an argument for historicity, where, let's say Jesus is talking in Arabic, that maybe these were phrases that he may have said.
Oh, absolutely. I have absolutely no doubt that that Jesus spoke Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. The Aramaic is not even questionable. Nobody's going to fight me on that one, right? But there are the same kinds of linguistic patterns in Luke in Greek for Jesus's words. The Beatitudes have a P sound repeated. They have an alliterative P sound. I didn't bring my notes up for that because I didn't think I'd be defending Luke in Greek. But in John, where he talks about being born again or born from above, that's a wordplay in Greek that makes no sense in any other language. So, if anybody wants to fight me that Jesus only spoke Hebrew, we'll meet in the backyard and talk about that. But yeah, I have no doubt that he spoke Hebrew, he spoke Greek, and he spoke Aramaic. And again, in Aramaic, we have places in both Hebrew Matthew and in Greek Mark where the Aramaic is transliterated and put on display for everybody. But yeah, like you say, this is the kind of thing that makes sense historically. I'll let the mythicists fight that fight if they want to say that it could be done another way, but probably anything can be done another way. But you're right. As far as little tiny pebble in the pond of this shows that it's historical. It is another little pebble in that pond. It definitely raises that bar just a little bit. It is something. These are recorded words of somebody who would say things in Hebrew and in Greek. And then the Sermon on the Mount. There are all kinds of things where there are alliterations in Hebrew, and then there are also alliterations in the Greek versions. And so, and again, the traditionalists can fight me on this. I think that the Sermon on the Mount is a conglomeration of actually 3 or 4 different speeches. Some of them given in Greek and some of them given in Hebrew, and some of them I've been told make more sense in Aramaic. I don't speak any Aramaic. I don't read any Aramaic. I can recognize the alphabet. That's it. I'm working on that, but that's a long-term project. But I've been told some of like the Lord's Prayer makes more sense in Aramaic. And so again, we may have one section that's composed of several speeches, some of them given in Greek, some of them given in Aramaic, and some of them given in Hebrew. And that would make the most sense to me from what I see in the data. Or he may have just written the same speech in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic with word plays and puns for each one in their own little individual spot and given one big speech. The traditionalists can fight me on that. I don't care. Some of them are scary. But yeah, there's word plays and puns like this all over the Hebrew Matthew. And so that was kind of the first thing that made me take it seriously. But I never, when I only got that far, I wouldn't fight anybody over it. In particular, there was nothing to fight about. There was no new text in Hebrew Matthew where I'm saying, aha, because you don't have this text, you're wrong. It's the same gospel. The biggest difference between the Hebrew Matthew and the Greek Matthew is that in chapter 7, when Matthew, or when he in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged," the Hebrew adds, "And condemn not, lest you be condemned." So that's the big difference, and that's in Luke. So I when I got that far, I wouldn't fight anybody over it.
And what's the significance of that? That would
nothing. Nothing. Yeah. It's an interesting tidbit. It's trivia.
Sure.
And that's why I wouldn't fight anybody over it. It's more a matter of I'm more right than you are by 1%. And I like being right. And, the time when I finally got to a place where I would be willing to actually stand up for Matthew being in Hebrew was actually last year. I decided to make one of my projects finding out, putting together all my notes for why I thought Matthew was in Hebrew, and ended up being over 30,000 words. And some of it I had like scribbled notes, but I never thought it would be important. But it ended up being the definitive thing where I went, no, I'm actually right and you're actually wrong. Um, the biggest thing for me, as far as like big things, is what's called assimilation. It's a text critical term. Uh, if you have, say, for example, you have two stories of the Three Little Pigs. I have a version of the Three Little Pigs that I wrote for my son, uh, where the big bad wolf doesn't just say, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. And the little pig doesn't just say, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. The big bad wolf then goes on to say, on the houses that he can't blow down, he then goes on to say, then I'll rip and I'll tear and I'll stomp all about. And the little pig says, not by the hair on my little piggy snout. And you can tell if somebody's been reading mine when they include that in that order, even if it's in another language, because that only comes from me. I made that up. There are cases where the Hebrew Matthew has things worded differently than the Greek Matthew, and the Greek Matthew very obviously took the text out of either Mark or Luke to match instead of translating it directly. The most obvious of these is in chapter 10 when he gives the list of the apostles. Uh, uh, Matthew in Hebrew uh, gives Philip and Bartholomew before James and John, whereas Matthew in Greek takes the text from Luke, which gives John and James before Philip and Bartholomew. And so, if you're looking at the three of them side by side, the Hebrew Matthew, the Greek Matthew, and Greek Luke, you go, oh, these two borrowed from each other. One of them borrowed from the other. And this one's different, so it's original. And there's no real reason to put them in that order. And in text criticism, if you can come up with a reason, that's probably the reason. And when you can't come up with a reason, then it's probably original. Just to kind of, that's a quick and dirty assessment of text criticism. The text critics and the audience are going, no, that's not it. But it's kind of it.
Is there a term for that rule of thumb?
It's assimilation.
Got it. So if it seems to just pop out of nowhere, it's probably original.
Yeah, if it doesn't, that's a good way to put it. If it doesn't match anything else, it's probably original. And you see this even in the Greek Gospels. You'll have cases where you'll have a manuscript where they take a whole paragraph out of Mark and they'll put it in Matthew because they've memorized Mark, and they get to the first two words and they go, oh, I know this part, and write without even looking. And then the text critics are going, wait, only these four manuscripts have that section lifted out of Mark. It's probably different. It's probably wrong. They probably just copied that out of Mark.
That's a good argument to say that if it just appears out of nowhere, like why would you, like with Philip, beginning the list with Philip, why would you do that when they're not very prominent? Like
why would the Hebrew, if the guy translated from Greek to Hebrew, why would he do that? And there's no good reason. Another one, the same kind of thing, when John the Baptist is talking about Jesus will come after me and he'll baptize with the fire of the Holy Spirit in the Hebrew Matthew. Greek Matthew gets to that part and he goes, no, I've read this in Luke and it's fire and the Holy Spirit. And Hebrew Matthew doesn't have an and there. It says fire of. And of is not really a word in Hebrew, but that's a whole grammar conversation we don't want to have. But and there's a couple of others. there's a couple of verses in the expelling of the demons into the pigs, expelling of Legion into the pigs, which he's not called Legion in Matthew, but that's neither here nor there. There's a whole verse, or a whole last half of a verse, that gets lifted straight out of Mark into the Greek Matthew. It's not in the Hebrew Matthew at all. Every place that you see the an Old Testament passage or an Aramaic or a Hebrew word interpreted, that doesn't happen in the Hebrew Matthew. They, when it says we shall call his name Emmanuel, in the Greek it says, which means the Lord with us. Well, in Hebrew it doesn't say that. It just says we'll call his name Emmanuel, because if you're reading Hebrew, you know what it says. But what's interesting is even in the places where what's listed as in Aramaic, he still doesn't have the translation. And even some of the places where Mark has the Aramaic, Hebrew Matthew will also have the Aramaic, but it won't have it translated. Mark will have the Aramaic, but it'll have it translated. And Greek Matthew will either have the Aramaic and then have it translated, like it is in Mark, or it'll just say it straight through. When Jesus says to the little girl, "Rise up," that those words are preserved in Aramaic in Hebrew Matthew, but there's no translation. It's just a couple of Aramaic words in a Hebrew document, presumably because Matthew thought everybody who speaks Hebrew also speaks Aramaic, whereas whoever was translating it into Greek said some of the people who speak Greek don't speak Aramaic. At the end, when Jesus is quoting in the crucifixion, when he's quoting the Psalm, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" One of the things that's interesting is in the Hebrew Matthew, that statement is in Aramaic. In Greek Matthew, Eli, Eli is written as it would be pronounced in Hebrew, not how it would be pronounced in Aramaic. And then you have an Aramaic word after that. And so that's, you had some translator who gets that part, and Eli is spelled the same because they don't have vowels in either Hebrew or Aramaic at that point. It's spelled the same in both Hebrew and Aramaic. So your Greek translator gets that part, and he goes, my God, so he's just writing that in Hebrew, how it would be pronounced in Hebrew, and then he gets to an Aramaic word, and he's like, my people won't know the difference. I'll just write that one in Aramaic. They think it's all a magic language anyways. Nobody cares. And so you see these little things popping up like this over and over and over again. It's like I said, the biggest thing to me was the cases of assimilation. But it wasn't one big thing that convinced me I'm right and everybody else is wrong. It was a whole series of little nitpicky little points where, well, actually this makes more sense in Hebrew, and this makes more sense in Hebrew, and this makes more sense in Hebrew. And we were talking, you had the other guy on who was reversed from me. He thinks Matthew was written first, but it was written in Greek. There are sections of Matthew which read better in Greek. The Beatitudes are alliteration in Greek, and the Beatitudes are kind of a bad example for this particular point. But there's a whole bunch of others that aren't in dialogue that still make sense in Greek, and they all have parallels in Mark, which was written in Greek. And one of the things that I discovered that I found absolutely fascinating is everywhere there's a parallel with Mark that has where he talks about thieves, Matthew uses an Aramaic word, which is a loan word from Greek. So he can match Mark as close as he can, even when Matthew is quoting the Old Testament. There's a point where he quotes an Old Testament passage about thieves, and instead of including the Hebrew of the Old Testament, he includes this this Greek through Aramaic loanword. But everywhere there's not a parallel passage with Mark, he uses just a regular, any old Hebrew word for thieves. And so, again, it's not one decisive case that led me to Mark was written first. It's a whole bunch of little nitpicky, little point, little point, little point. And I've read some Matthew priority cases, and they're the same thing. They're one little point, one little point, one little point to add to make their case. There's enough room to argue over that. And honestly, I haven't put as much deep dive into Mark and priority as I have into Matthew and Hebrew. And I wouldn't fight somebody on that if they said, no, you can only come in my club if you agree to only talk about Matthew being first. I'll go, okay. But if I'm only going to be in your club if I say Matthew was written in Greek, I got other clubs.
Yeah. So there's not really like a slam dunk argument. It's mostly like tiny little, what do we want to call it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of them are one little point, one little point. The biggest thing, like I said, if there were one big point, it would be the assimilation. And that's the one that's, recognized by text critics. It's, it's obvious. It's like you're not looking at these and going, well, I can see how the translator went from this Hebrew to this Greek, or from this Greek to this Hebrew. It's, oh, wow, whoever translated that really screwed up, unless they were copying Luke or Mark. And if you get to looking at the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus is saying the temple will be taken down in this generation. The Olivet Discourse starts out in all three Greek versions saying, "See that nobody will deceive you," whereas in Hebrew Matthew it starts out with, "So that nobody will deceive you." And if you're looking at that, like I said, if you're looking at the four of them side by side, Hebrew Matthew, Hebrew Greek, or Greek Matthew, Greek Mark, Greek Luke, if you're looking at all four of them side by side, you go, wow, in this Matthew translation, somebody screwed up. Somebody wrote that wrong, unless he copied it. And that makes sense for him to be copying from the others when he's doing the translating. It makes less sense for him to be doing it wrong, especially, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I know there was, let's see, Dr. Dan McClellan. He just did an episode today on his, I think, TikTok, saying that there's the word Alma for, and then in Greek it's Parthenos. So it's like a virgin will conceive, right? That they said that mix-up could only happen in Greek. Hopefully, I'm phrasing it right. That he seems to be referencing like the author of Matthew knows Greek and is taking the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew Old Testament and translating that to make their point.
Yeah. So there's a whole series of like really sticky points when you get to that one. It's one of those, if I were just going to debate on that one issue, I would pull together a whole series of notes for just it. But the idea is that Alma just refers to a single young lady, whereas Parthenon is a little more specifically a virgin. And when the translator of Isaiah from Hebrew to the Septuagint, or for those that are a little more nitpicky, the Old Greek, he translated Alma as Parthenon because he got it wrong. And I've looked into this, and there's not as much to it as what some people say. When you get to looking at places where Parthenon is used in the Old Testament, there's one time where it's used to refer to a prostitute. And I'm pretty sure she wasn't a virgin. Just throwing that out there. So it, and then the same thing with Alma. There are
so the same
times
ambiguity exists for both terms.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's times where Alma is used to talk about, you should only, I mean, to kind of bring things in Proverbs up to modern terminology. You should only go out with somebody who's an Alma, not somebody who's a prostitute. And so, I mean, that's kind of making a distinction there. And so it's kind of a, sometimes they're all these words are a little bit slippery. And so it's not as clear cut as some people like to make it. It's also not nothing, if you know what I mean. I don't, when people pointed that out to me the first time, 15 years ago, saying, well, this is the reason I think it was written in Greek, it stopped me in my tracks the first time. And it's like, oh, wow. Actually, I looked this word up in the various dictionaries that I have available, and Alma never has virgin listed as a definition, and Parthenon always has virgin listed as a definition. It's only when you get to the nitpicky that you go, actually, there's a little bit of slippery here. And so it's like, I don't want to totally say they've got nothing. And, it's one of those, I would love to see, it could totally be that when a real text critic gets their hands on the family of Hebrew Matthew, that they get into it and find that there really is some kind of translational issue there. But and then the other part of it is fast and loose.
Oh, here looks like I don't know if it's on my end or your end, but I think you're a bit frozen.
Oh, wait, I think I'm back.
Oh, yep.
Did I lose you for
Welcome
a
back.
second?
Yep, you froze there for a sec. Yeah.
Sorry about that. That was probably my Wi-Fi. But yeah, the other thing is Matthew always plays fast and loose with his prophecy fulfillments. When you get the modern grammatical historical method is completely alien. He never does that. He never does.
Oh, yeah, you're in and out again.
I don't have a problem with that. I deal with Matthew as he is.
Oh, here. You're frozen again.
Am I back?
Yeah, your audio is back.
Okay. All right. But yeah,
All right, there we go.
I take Matthew as he is, and so, there's kind of two levels to it. One, I'm not sure the distinction between Parthenon and Alma is as strict as people want it to be. And then I'm also not convinced that Matthew is using prophecy in quite that same way that people are trying to make him use it. He's very fast and loose with his prophecy. When he says, I called my son out of Egypt, this is a reference to calling the nation of Israel out of slavery. So, he's not saying Jesus is a slave. He's not saying Jesus is a nation. He's not saying, there's a lot of things he's not saying that Hosea was saying when he used that prophecy. And so, like I say, Jesus just plays a lot more fast and loose um, with prophecy than what some 21st century people are comfortable with. I just try to meet Matthew where he's at. Altogether, that makes me a little less impressed, but like I say, it's still not nothing. It's something to be aware of, and it's something for deeper text critics to put in their back pocket, and keep watching on as they watch on. And it may be that a further text critic gets deeper in and finds out, hey, there's actually something else going on, or a theologian. It may not be a text critical issue; it may be a theological issue where somebody comes in and they go, oh, wait a minute, actually, when Jesus uses prophecy, it's like this, and he's saying this. So, A times B, we get, this meaning out of it. And, that would be something that I found interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah. So when it comes to, our case for Matthew being originally in Hebrew, so we've got the early church fathers always mention it was originally in Hebrew, and then there's like linguistic arguments that puns and wordplay make more sense in Hebrew. And then was there another argument, or there's assimilation where go ahead.
Yeah, and then there's assimilation in the Greek text to match the other synoptics that isn't there in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
And those are probably the three biggest.
Gotcha. And so when someone comes back and they say, well, we've never seen an early manuscript of Matthew in Hebrew, would you just say, well, I mean, you'd have to say, well, that it's just lost, right? Or is there?
No. So there is a small family of Hebrew manuscripts that I think descend from the one Matthew wrote. And the most famous one currently is in George Howard's book. It's Shem Tov. I don't like it. It's got a lot of problems. My favorite is Hebrew manuscript 132 from the Paris National Library. It was found by a French guy whose last name is either Dutelet or Dutelet or something. I do not pronounce French, and every time I try to pronounce it, I get told I'm pronouncing it wrong. And when I fix it to how they tell me to pronounce it, the next guy tells me that was wrong. So I don't speak French, and I don't care. And then there's another edition that was put out by Munster just a little bit before that. Then last year, when I was researching my reasons, I had a note that said, I've also heard rumors about a Hebrew manuscript at Prague. Somebody should look into that. And I read that and I said, I'm somebody. And I started looking into it, and I never did find scans of the manuscript in Prague, but there is a manuscript in the British Library that's a part of the Harley collection that is also a part of this family. And then there was a printed edition of Matthew put out by some guy who has like 42 letters in his names, and it's in Latin, so I can't hope to pronounce it. But if you go to my blog, his name's in there. And it's the main text is just a reprint of Munster, but along the sides he has notes of other Hebrew readings he's familiar with, and some of them match the Paris manuscript, and some of them don't. And this was a couple years before the Paris manuscript was discovered. So these readings were out there, and so I think there's enough to do some text criticism. I'm not a trained text critic. I did put together notes in my version of Matthew in Hebrew that indicate majority readings. And as I did that, I actually think that my majority readings are better than just the Paris manuscript itself. It just seems to me to be better. It brought it even closer in alignment with the Greek texts that are out there, and that kind of makes sense. You have one manuscript; it's easy for one guy to make some mistakes here and there. But when you've got, by that time I'm up to 5 or 6 different sources I'm drawing from. I mostly stuck to the 3, to Shem Tov and Dutilit and Munster, because those are the ones I had easy access to. The printed one that I was talking about, the first set of scans I found were so blurry I could only read it when I already knew what it said, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've seen scans of books like that. But the Harley manuscript, it has times where it'll skip a whole verse even. And so I said, I'm not going to use that as a primary witness, but I did go back and double check a lot of the things where it's like, all 3, Munster, Dutilit, and Shem Tov, they all go in 3 different directions. I did go back to the Harley manuscript a couple times and say, and what does this one say? And it would usually either agree with Munster or with Dutilit. And again, I didn't check every single case, so it's somebody may do a deeper dive and say, actually, it more often agrees with Shem Tov, and the guy that does the deeper dive is more right.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's the whole idea with, if Christianity originated from a Jewish sect, we would expect it to have Hebrew language, right? That it's interesting how we don't have that when we would expect it to be the case.
Exactly. That's, especially when we do have church fathers who explicitly say, it's like you say, it's interesting that if Greek Matthew really was the original one, it's interesting that all we have left of our Jewish roots are a couple of Aramaic phrases scattered amongst the Gospels and Paul's letters. And when you don't even have to take off both socks to count all your Aramaic phrases, it kind of feels like you lost something. But it's interesting isn't evidence. It's just interesting.
Yeah. Do you suppose that there's like so we're saying Mark was first. I don't think anybody disputes that Mark was in Greek. So how did it come?
There are a couple of people who wrongly assert that Mark was written in Latin, but they're wrong.
Yeah, that would be silly. I've not heard that idea, but I mean, I'm sure there's a case to be made.
It's not as silly as it sounds, but it is wrong. Mark was Peter's translator in Rome. Newsflash, Peter spoke both Aramaic and Greek. So Mark was translating something else. Maybe. It doesn't ever actually say Mark was his translator to Latin anywhere, but this is the line of thinking that people use, is he must have been Peter's translator from Greek and Aramaic to Latin, because there were Latin speaking people in Rome. And I can follow people that far. I can say that part I can agree with, or I can leave it. I don't have enough evidence to go one way or the other. But the simple fact is, our best Latin sources all say that Mark wrote in Greek. There's a couple of Aramaic sources that say he wrote in Latin. There's like 1 or 2 really late people who wrote in Greek who say he wrote in Latin. who obviously are borrowing from the Aramaic people. But when you get down to it, everything that he wrote makes more sense in Greek. There's puns and word plays in Greek Mark, just like there is in Hebrew Matthew, and they don't carry over to Latin. And so Mark was a very gifted speaker. I can be sure of that. But
So, I mean, so if we look at the synoptic problem, we're essentially saying that M was Hebrew, right? So Matthew knows Mark, and maybe he knows Luke, which those are both in Greek. But then there's a portion, maybe it might not line up with that. Like if the portions of Matthew that aren't in Luke uh, are in Hebrew. But that, I mean, if that were the case, that would be a pretty good argument for
yeah, so that runs afoul of Occam's razor. You're inventing unknown unknown gospels that nobody ever commented on. And that's my problem with Q. Is if Q existed, I think Jerome and Augustine would have commented on it. They wouldn't have said, "Oh, look, this is where Matthew and Mark and Luke all came from." They'd say, "Oh, look, this guy extracted all of his stuff from Matthew and Mark and Luke." But I'm not convinced that Q existed as a document for that reason. But if Matthew wrote in Hebrew, or let me start from the beginning. If Mark wrote in Greek, Matthew copied a lot of Mark and wrote in Hebrew, and then Luke either simultaneously or at least unknowingly wrote Luke in Greek, and then somebody memorized Mark and Luke, or very nearly memorized Mark and Luke in Greek, and then translated Matthew from Hebrew to Greek, it explains it all. It explains why there's word plays that work in Hebrew. It explains why there's word plays that work in Greek. It explains why it explains why there's no sign of a Q document. It explains why there are sections that match up so well. It even explains why the Greek of Matthew is so smooth, because he's copying from documents. The translator is copying from documents originally written in Greek for the vast majority of it. So it's one unified theory that explains everything, without multiplying unknown quantities. The thing that people will say in contrast to that is right, is Occam razors is a guideline, not a rule. So they can postulate an M source, a Q source, an L source, and then Matthew copying from M and Q, and Luke copying from Q and L, and Mark being written first. They can postulate all these extra sources, and it's not against the rules, but it's against the guideline. And if they can come up with more decisive evidence in favor of these that can't be explained with with Matthew and Hebrew, I'd be interested to see that. I'm always open to, I'm an evidentialist. I follow the evidence. But I like something that accounts for all the evidence better than something that only accounts for a little bit of the evidence. Especially when the thing that only accounts for a little bit of the evidence has to create all these other things to explain itself. If I can have one theory that explains everything, explains why the early church fathers thought it was in Hebrew, why some things work in Greek, why some things work in Hebrew, why the Greek texts all match. If I can get all those in one nice little bundle, without inventing these other things, I like that. That feels good to me. But that's a personal feeling. Somebody else is going to say, well, it feels good to me to invent all these other things and have these other things. And, that's, at the end of the day, I'd love to sit down with a root beer float at the local A&W and argue with them about it just for fun. But I'm not going to kick them out of my church, and I'm not going to call them a heretic.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe that's a good place to sum up. Let's see, before we go, maybe we'll mention your blog again. That's Sean Kennedy dot blogs dot wait
Uh,
Sean Kennedy
Sean
dot
C.
WordPress.
Kennedy. Yeah, SeanCKennedy.wordpress.com. Sean is spelled with a U, not a W. Um, if you're having trouble typing all that in, you can go to Google and type Kennedy Hebrew Matthew, and I'll pop up in somewhere in the first 2 pages. I don't do enough to promote myself, so you may have to go to the second page to find me if you do that. But I'm, like I said, I do this. I had a major mental health breakdown about 6 years ago, and the only thing that helped was writing. And so I do a weekly blog. It's not to make money. It's a part of my mental health regimen, and um, and then to get to a point where I say I'm done, I publish a book on Amazon 4 times a year, and it's something that I do because it's cheaper and more effective than therapy. I make about $100 a month at it now, so I've kind of flipped the cheaper than
Yeah.
therapy on its head, and I'm trying. Right now, I give all of that away to charity. Right now, I have several charities that I funnel it off to, but a dollar at a time. But I'm getting to the point where it would make more sense to start, doing something with it. I'm not trained in any of this stuff, so I don't know what to do with it.
Well, and we should say for our viewers, it's not mutually exclusive, writing and therapy. You
No,
do both, and I
no,
would
no, no, no.
recommend.
If
Yeah.
you are having a mental, it was a therapist that recommended writing. So if you are having mental problems of any sort, if you are frustrated more than 3 times a day, go talk to a therapist. And even if they can't help you, they might be able to help you find the thing that can help you. And that's what happened in my case. As a therapist, he wasn't able to help me, and he said, I was running a martial arts school at the time. He said, well, have you tried, punching on the bag more? And I said, oh yeah, I'm punching on the bag all the time. And he said, okay, well, have you tried journaling? And I said, no. And I had a WordPress account from years before that I reopened, and start at first it started out, just whenever I had something on my mind that I had to get out. But then, when you have that kind of an attitude, it always tends to fall to the, well, I'll get to it next week. I'll get to it next week. And then
Mhm.
you're yelling at your kids. And so my wife said, we can get a divorce or you can do this weekly. And I said, well, when you put it like that, um, and so I started doing it weekly. And um, last year I popped it up to twice a week. On Saturdays I publish a post that'll be uh, whatever I'm thinking about, whatever project I'm working on, whatever. And then on Thursdays I have thoughts inspired by a movie. Right now I'm going through the My Little Pony Equestria Girls series, um, and but they're not all G-rated. I also did last October I did a series of horror movies. Um, so I do whatever's on my mind. I don't do it for anybody else. I do, my audience is me. But um, but yeah, I that's if you are having any kind of mental problems, talk to a therapist. Um, don't don't just start trying to journal because I said journaling helped me. Talk to your therapist if your therapist says, "Hey, you should try journaling." Try journaling. He may also suggest that you know, do the treadmill. He may also suggest that you get more sleep, and you know, whatever he suggests, go that way because he knows more about it than I do.
Yeah, very good. All right. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, everybody should. What's the name of your book about
Uh,
methane?
I have two. Uh, the the one that's just about Matthew Priority is Masoretic Matthew, and you can, if you know how to spell Masoretic, you can go onto Amazon and type Masoretic Matthew, and you can buy that, or you can go to my blog and you can read it all for free. Um, I've been told that I need to work on my marketing. The other one that I have that draws from the Matthew source is the corrected King James. I went through the King James version and lined up the Hebrew text word for word next to the King James, and anywhere they didn't match, I fixed it. And I use that as my primary translation in Matthew right now. I'm also a majority text guy for the most of the New Testament. And so my major project this year is doing the same thing, the King James next to the majority text. And I'm hoping to have that done by December 31st. I have two other projects. I've finished two projects this year, so I have two more left to do. If that one starts to get long, I have two other projects that I can bring that are short to finish up. So it may not be till next year. I'm not on anybody's schedule but mine.
Yep, that works. All right. Thank you. Thank you to everybody for watching, and thank you, Sean, for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and I will let everybody know about this.
Yep, absolutely. All
Have a
right.
good day.
Thanks so much.